Mr. Speaker!
Mr. Speaker!
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
Once a year, every year, since 1790, the President of the United States has delivered the State of the Union address, reflecting on the developments and challenges of governance. As researchers, we can study these documents, interpret them, impose categories on them, and use them to better understand our political history. But what happens when we let these texts speak for themselves? Scholars tend to agree that the ideology of American governance has changed over the course of our history. But there are long-standing debates about the crucial inflection points. Some people look to the Civil War, or the New Deal, or the Cold War. Just about every year has a proponent, and this lack of clarity offers us a chance to try a new approach, one that can answer how and when our political discourse has changed. That brings us back to the State of the Union. These addresses are a real goldmine for textual analysis, a research method in which we treat the words of a body of text as data and analyze it for patterns and trends. By applying these techniques to the entire State of the Union archive, we can detect changes in political discourse and see how they're expressed across time, all through the President's annual report to the nation.
Before my term is ended.
So we begin with the most common terms in the State of the Union speeches. These are the things that presidents talked about, the objects of governance over the course of the country's history. Things like economy, income, or recession. And then we looked at instances where these terms are used in the same paragraph. By grouping terms that frequently appear together, we can produce a sort of map or a network. Take a look at this one. It's a network of 1,000 key terms that appear together in speeches over the entire history of the State of the Union. You can see these distinct clusters. They're sets of terms that co-occur frequently together, more than they do with other terms. They represent the major topics of discussion, the major categories in State of the Union discourse, when we look back over the speech's entire history. So we can see modern foreign policy discourse here, and a much older conception of similar tasks, call it statecraft, here. We can also see the modern conception of domestic policy, and its counterpart from an earlier era, political economy. Now, that's interesting in its own right, but it doesn't tell us when change happened. To pinpoint the shift to the modern era, we looked at how frequently each term appeared in each State of the Union. And this allowed us to measure the degree of similarity between any two addresses on a scale from 0 to 1. We took that data and assembled a transition matrix with dates running from 1790 to 2014. But we'll come back to that. Let's start with this grid, a miniature version of the matrix, which we can use to represent levels of difference between 4 speeches from 2007 to 2010. First, we see that all the cells of the central diagonal are bright green. These represent the same speeches, so their level of difference is 0. Next, we can compare 2007 and 2008, George W. Bush's final 2 addresses. The color suggests that these speeches touched on very similar items, and the same can be said of Obama's first 2 speeches. Filling in the rest, we can see higher degrees of difference when comparing speeches from the 2 different presidents. And this makes sense. A president from a different party might want to talk about slightly different things than his or her predecessor would. Okay, so now here's the full transition matrix. It compares all State of the Union speeches to one another. And we see something pretty stark. Look at the contrast between the lighter and darker regions. The area in the upper left is dark because the addresses between 1790 and 1917 have a remarkable similarity. The same can be said about this area on the bottom right, which makes clear the similarity between addresses delivered since 1917. The lighter sections on either side indicate the relative difference between these 2 periods. So it's similar to what we saw for Bush and Obama, except instead of looking at a transition from one president to another, we're looking at a transition between 2 distinct regimes of political discourse. In fact, the differences between adjacent presidents are pretty small when compared to the change we see between these 2 distinct time periods. In other words, we found our historical turning point, 1917, the year America enters World War I. It's the war that ushered us into the modern period of American political consciousness. It's the first moment when the objects of political discussion resembled our own more than those of the 19th century. It also sets off a more rapid pace of change in the things that we talk about. which is clear from how much denser the dark patch for the first period is compared to the second. Okay, so now we know the moment that best divides the modern era from the past, but what that doesn't tell us is how the change actually looked as it happened. To figure that out, we divided up the history of State of the Unions into overlapping periods. They reach about 40 years in length. And then we made maps. They're similar to the network we showed you earlier, but for each of these networks, we get 10 sets of different clusters, and they represent the relevant topics of political discussion for each period. But unlike the categories from the first map, this time we capture only the connections that people could have perceived at each historical moment. These are the contemporary topics of political discourse. As you might expect, the topics from one period relate to those that came before and after. Take a look at this example. We're looking at the words in the cluster labeled action and law, its two most central terms. It's really a discussion of the federal role in regulating the railroads that appears in the late 19th century. In the next period, it splits into two related clusters, one labeled law and interstate commerce, and one called departments and recommendations. The one on the left is the evolving conversation about federal regulation, which leads off in one direction, while the one on the right is the progressive era discussion of the administrative state. We can think of the relationships between topics of different periods sort of like rivers. Over time, categories can swell and narrow, merge, or fork. Looking across history, we can see when and how these different streams have emerged, combined, separated, and even disappeared. For example, the topic of railroad regulation doesn't last very long and dissipates before 1920. But the one focused on federal bureaucracy has maintained itself up to the present. It's evolved to take up questions of energy and development. The topic flows across the 1917 divide, representing continuity between the pre-modern and the modern period. Two other contemporary discussions, one labeled Hope and Freedom, another Peace and Allies, descend from discourses on treaties, negotiations, and parties, which were all present in the earliest years of the Republic. Some discourses appear and disappear without leaving a long-lasting trace, like the discussion around law and the Constitution during the Civil War and Reconstruction. By using these different techniques of textual analysis, we can really see, for the first time, the way that our contemporary ideology relates to that of the past. And by tracing visible connections over time, we can also reveal how the past became the present.